and welcome to this Talk Stew podcast. I am your host, Don Kloss. In this podcast series, I speak on topics that are an amalgam of science, philosophy, history, religion, sociology and society, business, language, literature, the arts, even politics and beyond. I am not supported by any company, organization, or other entity. This podcast is not a Patreon. It is free, and you are encouraged to subscribe to this YouTube channel. The views expressed in the series are entirely my own and from my own experience and worldview. Talk Stew is a podcast originating from Columbus, Ohio. You can send your comments to me at my email address, 5254dkloss@gmail.com. In this edition, I take a look at something we are all familiar with called the suspension of disbelief. Whether you know the definition or not, you are all familiar with the term suspension of disbelief from your experience with watching television and movies, even reading books or watching television commercials. The most complete definition I have found comes from Wikipedia, and it is this, I quote, "Suspension of disbelief, sometimes called willing suspension of disbelief, is the intentional avoidance of critical thinking or logic in examining something unreal or impossible in reality, such as a work of speculative fiction, in order to believe it for the sake of enjoyment." I'm sure you listeners are probably wondering why I started this podcast by playing the Looney Tunes theme song, and there is a reason for it. My first experience with suspension of disbelief actually came from watching Saturday morning cartoons. And the biggest experience with this I had actually was with the Looney Tune cartoons. For example, Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd. Now, you know that Elmer Fudd was always on the hunt for Bugs Bunny. And one example of something that happened in the cartoons is that Elmer Fudd would catch Bugs Bunny point blank and would hold his shotgun up at him. Bugs Bunny would stick a finger, or if you will, a toe from his front paw into the barrel of the shotgun right as Elmer Fudd would pull the trigger. And rather than what would happen in reality, which would be Bugs Bunny getting his paw blown off, the shotgun would backfire, and the result would be the business end of the barrel of the shotgun being all flayed out, and Elmer Fudd ending up with powder burns all over his face and his collar torn up.
Be very, very quiet. I'm hunting weapons.
Which we know in reality that would not happen. Also, we saw time and again run-ins that Elmer Fudd had with Daffy Duck. For example, Elmer Fudd, when Daffy Duck would say, "Shoot him now, shoot him now," Elmer Fudd would shoot Daffy in the face, point blank, with a shotgun. And for example, Daffy's bill would spin around on his face and end up on the back of his head. Daffy would simply reach behind him, grab his bill, and pull it back to the front of his face. Now, again, we know that is totally unrealistic. And things like this happened time and time again. But as a kid, I didn't really think about that. It was just funny. It was part of slapstick. Violent things happening, but it was funny because nobody really got hurt. And that's what slapstick is all about. We learned that from the Three Stooges. Now, another example of this from Looney Tunes, which stretches it even further, is the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote cartoons. If we look at Wile E. Coyote, he really came up with some extraordinary devices to try and capture the Roadrunner, and these schemes that he came up with really showed a intuitive flair, and he calls himself a super genius, and in fact it is genius. The things he comes up with, they do show a real flair, if you will, for planning, for engineering, for logistics. He comes up with things that most people might not think of.
My name is Coyote. Wile E. Coyote. Genius.
Some of these plans and devices he comes up with. Now, of course, they don't work, and they always backfire on him, but just what he comes up with in theory is pretty ingenious. So we suspend disbelief that he is able to come up with these things and put these plans into action. The other side of this is that with the Roadrunner, here is an animal who in real life has a brain that is considerably smaller than that of a coyote, a pea-sized brain, and yet he is able every single time to see through what Wile E. Coyote is doing and is able to outsmart him. So, in reality, that would not necessarily happen. So, again, suspension of disbelief. And with most of these cartoons, the Looney Tunes and some of the others, just the simple fact that with most of these characters, you have talking animals. Animals that reason, animals that have sense of humor, sense of sarcasm, are able to show logic and subjectivity. They have very human traits, and again, you really are suspending disbelief to buy into this when you watch these cartoons. One of the best examples there with the Looney Tunes is the character of Foghorn Leghorn.
That's a joke, boy. You missed it. Went right past you. You gotta keep on your toes.
He shows a sense of the Southern good old boy logic and humor, and he uses a lot of the stock phrases and adages, and is a very likable character. But again, just the fact of a rooster talking, let alone having that type of a personality, you are really going out on a limb, suspending disbelief to follow this character. To my mind, where the creators of entertainment really started to stretch out and push us to the limits on our suspension of disbelief came in the late 1950s and into the 1960s with the Japanese filmmakers in their science fiction films, and more specifically in their monster-related films, such as the Godzilla movies, the Gamera movies, and so on. And the one example I would like to really examine or pick on, if you will, here was the short series entitled Johnny Sacco and His Giant Robot. This was a series of 16 one-hour episodes, and just the premise itself required one to suspend their disbelief to a great extent. In the first place, we are expected to believe that there is an alien, actually half alien, half monster being, who wants to take over the world, take over the universe, actually, and he is starting with the planet Earth and specifically with Japan. And he is not going to achieve this through invading armies, but rather through sending a series of monsters down to try and destroy Japan and then move on from there. So you got to suspend disbelief in that whole part of it to begin with. Now, what the Japanese government is planning to do about this is they have a secret defensive organization called Unicorn. And Unicorn has developed this gigantic robot that is a defensive weapon. But in their short-sightedness, they have developed this robot in such a way that it will only take commands from one person. And that is only from the person that is belonging to the first voice it hears through its wrist-held control module. As I said, pretty short-sighted. Well, through a kind of a bizarre series of events, what ends up happening is the first voice that it ends up hearing through this wrist control module ends up being that of a young boy.
Giant robot, go!
So a little suspension of disbelief there. So there's no reversing this. So what ends up happening is this young boy ends up being brought in as an agent of Unicorn. this boy named Johnny Sacco, because he's now the only one that can control Giant Robot. So you're really having to suspend disbelief here that you've got this young boy, he's probably not even 12 years old, that is now a secret agent for this secret Japanese government defense organization. And he is assigned a overseer agent, if you will, named Jerry Mono. To get even more crazy, after a couple of episodes, Unicorn also brings in another secret agent, which is a little girl about Johnny Sacco's age. And it's never really quite clear why this is done. So, more disbelief to suspend. Now, I won't go into all the crazy things that happen in each of these episodes. The monsters that Johnny and Giant Robot have to fight just get more and more bizarre as time goes on, and the situations are just more unbelievable with each episode. But you can see how illogical and unrealistic the whole thing is. And this is actually something that's not restricted to Johnny Sacco and his Giant Robot. There are plenty of other movies involving monsters of this ilk in which young children are allowed on military installations or on military battlefields. They are allowed to speak to military personnel and to people that are political officials, government officials, and they are listened to, and they are spoken to as if they are important adults. And you know this would never happen in the real world, but it happens plenty in these Japanese movies, especially in the Gamera movies. It happens in every single one of them. Again, not logical, not realistic, but there you have it. And it continues to this day with movies made in the United States, made in Canada. It happens in TV commercials, TV series. It even happens in books. For example, Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. I read the book and I saw the movie, and there was a lot of suspension of disbelief in both the book and the movie. And now, of course, this was a mashup between vampire hunters and a historical figure. That has to be taken at face value, but there was just an awful lot of unrealistic stuff that you had to buy into in order to be entertained by both the book and the movie. And what it comes down to, I think, is each individual person has their tolerance for how much disbelief they're willing to suspend. Everybody has a different threshold, a different point at which they are going to see something in a film or a TV show, or that they're going to read in a book, and they're just going to say, that's not logical. I'm not buying it. I call BS. And I don't know. I think for me, my threshold on that is probably a fair bit lower than the average person. This is probably why I don't watch a lot of movies, particularly ones that are the adventure drama movies that are coming out these days. I just can't buy into all of what goes on in these movies, especially with all of the really overdone special effects things and the theatrics and all of the incredible stunts that happen, because I know they're just so far away from realism and what might actually take place in the situations in these movies. So I just tend to shun the things altogether. I just don't want to see it because I know I can't buy into it. And I don't know how many other people feel that way about these things, or how many other people just, hold their arms out and embrace these things and just go along for the Nantucket sleigh ride. And again, going back to that definition, it's what an individual person is willing to buy into or willing to put up with, I suppose, in order to be entertained by whatever this media is that they are viewing or reading. I guess it's kind of an eye of the beholder thing, and my threshold, I guess, is a bit lower than most people out there that go to movies or binge watch on Hulu or Netflix or whatever it happens to be. So that's just me. To each his own, and I hope that everyone will give that a little bit of thought and not just blindly get sucked into everything that they see and read. Think about it a little bit. And is it something that is like a whirlpool sucking you down? Is it something that degrades your intelligence? Or is it something that you really don't mind getting pulled into just for the sake of blind entertainment? It's worth giving a little thought to. That's my slice, and that is it for this edition of Talk Stew. Again, you can send your comments to me through email at the address 5254DKLOSS@gmail.com. Thank you as always for listening. Take care.